This is again one of the sort of perspective-oriented talks, sort of in the line of the one that Helen offered yesterday and that Deirdre will offer on Friday. And so we're really delighted to have her here, and I'll let her take it from here.
Thank you, Adam, and I'm delighted too. It's been a real joy the last week and the first 2 weeks of this boot camp here. I feel like a kid in the candy store. So many questions and fun people to work with. And I'll add a whole bunch of other questions today from perspective of a survey statistician. That came across yesterday, I think a few times, primarily talk about surveys, but I have a couple of other heads. So this acronym here, the IIB, that's the Institute for Employment Research in Germany. They are a branch of basically the German version of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so I deal with a lot of administrative data there as well, and the issues of sharing those. And I'll come back to that at the very end for some examples too. I also want to thank the artist upstairs, and I think most of you have been on the next floor, and pretty much at this spot there's a beautiful depiction of campus here, and not just because I had to cut off the bottom part of the artist's name. I also noticed that I'm not exactly sure actually if that was Adel Javanmard. It's my guess. You know him? Okay. You can see the when you're upstairs, the two of the characters are removed. I thought that was a privacy-preserving measure, but then the alternative data source of the Simons Institute list of participants in the fall, gave this away. So anyway, thanks to Adele, I will shamelessly use this to make my points here, which I have 5 of that I want to make. I have grouped them into 2 categories. One sort of points about data collection and designing a data collection piece, and then 2 around the data analysis. And then I'll talk at the end, as I just mentioned, a little bit about sort of alternative perspectives. The first 5 points are really all sort of the combination of differential privacy for the kind of data we deal with. And we as in the statistical agencies and the research community and the social science and so on. I sprinkle a couple of literature and books that can eventually find their way upstairs into the talk as well. These ones are very dear to my heart because that's the reason I'm here. Cynthia and I, we both worked for, I guess it was roughly 2 years on a panel of the National Academy of Science with the goal to sort of give guidance, directions, thinking about innovations in federal statistics, and primarily doing so with privacy in mind. And we had a lot of fun, but these 2 books are also a very good sort of short summary, easy to read if you want to understand the lay of that land a little better. Okay, so let me start with the first point around data collection and sort of issues of recruitment and answering sensitive questions, which is something that the survey community has dealt with a lot. And I thought on Monday, when I saw Kobe's talk and this beautiful schema here, I thought, oh, perfect. Now I can just, point out that we have to think about the people that create the data as well. And then Sasha yesterday did that and showed you the sampling. But as I will point out, Sasha, and she said it herself, where are you, Sasha?
I'm here.
That there were, in the statistics perspective yesterday, quite some simplifying assumptions on how the people provide their data, and at the end you had sort of an outlook and the call out for me to drill down a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do. So the first piece I want to mention and get in your head is sort of on the data collection side, very different to the data we talked about on Monday, and in particular, you guys, if I think of data that Google produces or other big platforms are happening on the web, the data we'll deal with are usually data produced in a fashion that we beg someone to participate and beg someone to give us answers, right? It's very different. It's not, they aren't, so, this schema works well actually for what we've done on Monday, because there are a lot of situations in which data are there. You use the service and then you use it for a different reason, and then it's sort of the secondary use of the data we are discussing. the situation here is quite different. You know, you really want people to respond, and you want them to respond to sensitive questions. And in that context, actually, we have a history. These papers are more recent, but the history, of course, is way back when. Randomized response was, well, actually, I should stop here. When randomized response was, you know, first discussed, the survey community in the survey session jumped on that because they loved the idea, right? Let's just give the respondent a coin and a randomizing device of sorts, and then have them flip the coin and give them 2 questions, and then they answer one of them and whatnot. And over decades, I feel like every decade there's like a big paper and a big attempt to do it yet again, but it has never taken off, right? I mean, you would think we ask so many sensitive questions, but in the field, we have seen it has never really worked. And there were more recently a couple of studies that really tried to do this again on the web, where it's a little easier maybe to do the randomizing device also for more complicated questions. There were a student of mine, Antje Kirchner, she worked on a study where we had the true score, so we really could compare, you know, do people report more sensitive or not. But the biggest problem to this is it's really hard to explain. I mean, it looks like voodoo, right? You go there and it's like flip the coin, and then you answer a question that I don't know what the answer was to, and people have troubles, you know. So understanding that was a problem. But then also, with a limited understanding comes the problem that you, then your best guess, or your best choice is to just not reveal the sensitive information, right? If you don't know exactly if it's going to be private, then it's better to say, no, I did not smoke marijuana last night, right? Or whatever it is that you were asking. And so that has shown that, you know, in studies, I mean, I should say, in fairness, if you have resources in a smaller research setting, or a situation in which you can really train the interviewers well, and, you know, you can make it happen. I'm not saying it doesn't work ever, but in large-scale surveys with, you know, where you have thousands of interviewers in the field, that's a real challenge, right? And so what we have seen that in many situations, actually, if you establish enough rapport with an interviewer that they would understand this kind of thing, there probably is also a setting in which they would trust sufficiently to reveal the sensitive answer. And so many of these comparative studies did show that the direct asking or the direct questioning reveals better estimate of the truth. I did a series of work a while back on sort of other methods to capture sensitive information. So the biggest signal that we get that removing the interviewer gives you better report is when the survey field did experiments like we did here, where we randomized people to answer on the telephone interviewed by an interviewer, on the web without an interviewer, or with an interactive voice response system also over the phone, right? And so these two have no interviewer and create a more private mode, if you will, of reporting. And so we did a study where we also had true scores from the University of Maryland administrative record system, I mean, the university records, and asked the alumni if they dropped the class, if they got the D or F, and, you know, they were on warning and probation, sort of somewhat sensitive stuff, maybe. Well, actually, it is sensitive because this is perceived sensitivity that they report here. But you see that even the perceived sensitivity is different by mode. So as soon as we remove the interviewer, those are the lighter dots, the perceived sensitivity is lower for all of these items. But what's also a driver is, of course, whether you exhibit that behavior or not, right? So these things are not necessarily sensitive for people who are not subject to that problem, which is always something that we and tend to forget. And obviously the warning or probation was the most sensitive one, but only for those that were asked by an interviewer, right? So it's the interviewer is the hurdle, but then what we saw in these comparison of studies like this to randomized response is that with an interviewer that explains that, you still have the interviewer present as the hurdle, right? So this is not necessarily helping the way we hope to. Okay, just to give you a flavor of sensitive questions, I mean, these surveys that the federal government, but also many others put out, they are filled with questions that you really might, feel quite strongly about. A fantastic example of a survey that was done on, I think, all active military on sexual assault, both females and males. by Rand, and that report I can highly recommend to anyone, but it also shows that with careful design, you get good responses or trustworthy responses to open-ended questions. And so I don't know if in this case, large scale on the web, we could have for each of these questions implemented a randomized response technique, right? Okay, so that's on the data collection side. Obviously, what we're talking here is doing this post hoc, right? But I just want to put that out there that the trust is a big element in this. And so the Census Bureau has for years measured how much people trust the federal government as data collector and things like that. And this question that you see here is data from the Gallup tracking poll, where they ask if people respondents to the daily tracking poll think that the data are kept confidential in the federal statistical system. And you see here that this stayed pretty constant over time, but it is not up there. I mean, there is already a strong belief across the board that data is shared across government agencies, even agencies that don't have an agreement for sharing data. And so the public perception on what happens with the data is already in a strong disconnect to what's actually going on. And so this is an interesting thing to keep in mind as we're trying to protect them even more. It's like if we can't get that across, then it might not help with the recruitment if our concern is that people don't participate. Right? So I mean, if the main reason why we want to fix this problem is that we want to fix perception, then it has been a problem long before. So this is 2012, right? So long before we have all these discussions about big data and data sharing. Yeah, sure, absolutely.
What is the random sample of people who are surveyed, or what is the population they're looking at? I'm also wondering if there are differences in beliefs from younger generation in comparison to millennials versus an older generation, those who are, let's say, Facebook generation.
Yeah. There are definitely differences across the generation. There are differences across the ethnic groups. I don't have the exact percentages in my head. I can look this up. The Jennifer Hunter-Childs gave this presentation in Barcelona last fall. I have a slide deck. It's cleared for public consumption. I mean, she does that for the Census Bureau. I will check with her if I can post it to the group, and then you can see those figures. I don't know them off the top of my head, but it is the Gallup tracking poll. It's a telephone survey, but they do aim at a we'll talk about random samples in a moment, but they aim to at least get landline and cell phone users and things like that. So it's not a quick online poll. What you have. What I've seen in my own research for Germany on this, there I can speak a little better to that. In particular, your question on data sharing by the government or private sector companies among the different generations. What we've clearly seen is that people with a lot of experience in using technical devices think even more that the data will be shared, but they have less concerns, right? So this is very nuanced in all directions. But what I find interesting here, and work from Eleanor Singer over the years showed that time and again too, that we always make these strong confidentiality statements at the beginning of a survey, and despite that, there is a good belief that these data will be shared, and the research she's done actually showed that if you emphasize that too much, then that harms participation, because then people think their information is much more sensitive than it actually is. I mean, that the risk that they're engaging in that research is actually far greater than what they thought it is. Just because, so they experimentally manipulated these consent statement, right, and saw that. So the messaging is important, I guess. That's the short message of this segment.
So what was the citation for that last?
Eleanor Singer, she did a series of work. I'll post that to the Slack group, but you'll find it under her name. Out of the University of Michigan. One piece on messaging that Cynthia and I talked about last week a little bit. So this sentence up here is clipped from an invitation to a mail survey. And it's very typical for invitations or advanced letters that we send to respondents. your participation is vital to this effort, right? We really hone in that we need people's participation in that survey, right? As I said, the data aren't there. They just, they just don't just happen. They need to be carefully collected. And that is in some contrast, I would say, to this statement here, right? And I can't quite figure out how I would message that, right? It's like, if we really need you, but then whether your data is in there or not really doesn't matter. So that, so I'll challenge you, to if this is jointly a message, we should think about how we want to word this. So one of the research questions for this segment here is really how to communicate, how do we communicate the methods? How do we establish sufficient trust, right, in this whole operation? And I can see that maybe we end up in a place where you don't need to understand, right? Unlike with the randomized response, where in that moment you need to know. Maybe if there's generally the notion that data is kept safe by everybody in a certain way, that the trust will happen that way. It's like, yeah, they're sharing data, but nothing can happen, right? I mean, if that's sort of the common norm, then maybe we are good. So I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying right now it's a challenge. Okay. Any question to that piece before I move on? Okay.
Well,
yeah.
This is the obvious question, which is when they say share, do they say with whom?
Yeah. So. In these consent statements, often they do. In the experiments we did, we always address the sender. So shared with the researcher, shared for commercial purposes, but not necessarily as fine-tuned as it would be necessary to really hit all your parameters, I would say. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the dirty business of data collection. I indicated, data just don't just happen. And what I find useful when we talk about a survey statistic, to think about the two steps that go in there to get the inference right. And they're really two steps of inference. Sasha was talking yesterday about this step here, getting to the target population, and made sort of a leap of faith saying most samples are simple random samples, which I will contest in a second. But the other piece is that there's really another inference step as well, which is on the measurement side, right? The response we get is not necessarily always exactly our construct. And a good example for that is always sort of crime statistic. The National Crime and Victimization Survey is a very important survey, very expensive survey. And you could, naively say, it's like, okay, well, reported crime, if I want to measure that, we have crime reports in administrative data and can get it from there. But you really need in surveys to ask both reported crime so that you can then ask the unreported crime. And we know that there for certain crimes, there's quite a big difference between the two. So you can't rely on these administrative data alone. And that's something that in this panel I mentioned at the beginning, we discussed at length, right? While there are exciting other data sources to describe what happens in society, by themselves, they often are not sufficient. You for many research questions we have, or public policy questions, we need to augment it with the survey data. So this combination of different data sources is just no way around, at least for now. So here you see the measurement instrument that would be implemented in the survey is already, it is correlated with the construct we are interested in, but it's not quite that, right? I need to define a time frame. I need to, get more specific on what I mean with crime and things like that. So there's already a first error source here, the validity of how I phrase that question and the actual construct I want. So this is a leap. And there's already, you can hope that's highly correlated, but that's the hardest one to measure. But then, of course, on the next step, getting the respondent's answer, in some instances might be pretty easy, and you think there's a good mapping. But in other instances, not so much. So I brought a little audio clip with me.
Now I'd like to ask you some questions specific to your diet. For the next group of questions, I'll ask you how much you favor or oppose engaging in certain behaviors. After I say the behavior, please say one of the following. Strongly favor, somewhat favor, neither favor nor oppose, somewhat oppose, or strongly oppose. The first behavior, avoiding fast food.
Avoiding what? I'm sorry?
Avoiding fast food.
Oh, avoiding fast food. Yeah, somewhat.
Somewhat. are strongly favored, somewhat favored, either favored or opposed, somewhat opposed, or strongly opposed.
Yeah, I somewhat favor avoiding fast food.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. I'm not strongly opposed to avoiding fast food, which would insinuate that I eat fast food all the time, correct?
Oh, whatever you mean.
I mean, I just want to be clear on the language that I'm using to define what,
So just for clarification, you did say somewhat favored, right?
Do I somewhat favor fast food?
No, avoiding,
Oh,
somewhat
okay.
somewhat favored, avoiding that.
Yes. Thank you, yes.
So let me tell you, this is not
There's like
staged.
a negative in there, so I favor that.
This is the reality of data collection, right?
Hang up, right?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I cut it off. I mean, they were continuing the conversation, but so there are two people really trying to get it right? One maybe reading the phone while on the phone or something, right? Some slightly distracted respondent, and an interviewer, he does exactly what he needs to do, right? He gets the somewhat, but he needs to know, is this somewhat favor or opposed? Not make an inference, ask again, but then not explain too much because he or she shouldn't put in their own bias to this. So this is pretty typical, And so I felt like it's important to expose you to that a little bit because it's so easy to, once the data are there, they're just data. But there's a cognitive process going on here, and there has been over the years quite some...
Now I'd like to ask...
quite some literature on sort of mapping out potential sources for this measurement error, right? So cognitive shortcuts people do, heuristics when they hear, But what is clear is that whatever, your response is, is hopefully the true score plus some error. And then, there might be the assumption that this is random, but and just noise in some sort, and it could be to some extent. In this case here, next time you call this respondent, you might get a slightly different answer. So over iterations, we can't necessarily be sure with these answer categories. But if it's a good measurement, then we hope that sigma is 0. But there are biases, of course, that happen, and one needs to take into account. So there's, it's a bit of work. In some instances, there's another error source coming in through post-processing when in particular at census, there's a huge editing operation going on, inconsistencies between answers that get removed and things like that. So open questions for me here with respect to sort of what we are doing here is, as I showed you, the response burden is quite high for some of these things. I mean, if you listen into questions on sort of labor market histories and trying to reconstruct where, when did you work, for how much money, what did you buy, it gets really tedious. And the consumer expenditure survey, if you want to go through what you bought the last 3 months, we can hook you up with some interviewers to experience that live. It gets really tedious to remember all of this, remember what you paid for it, how much tax you paid for it, and whatnot. So the hope really is there to link this to other data sources, to administrative data sources that have the employment records, to your, credit card or what have you, just to make that rest of the data collection easier and better. Right? So I think the attempt is there, and what we've seen over the years playing with requests on data linkage is that there is actually quite a substantial willingness of those survey respondents to have their data linked, right? Even without it, in the normal set of privacy assurances that we do there. But what is interesting, so this paper here that Joe Sachs and I wrote a few years ago shows sort of linkage consent rates across many different fields. In the studies we do in Germany, we often get up to 80 or 90% consent, although only for those who already consented to do the survey, right? There's a little bit of a trade-off here to keep in mind. But this line of research also shows that there's quite some difference in these statements depending on how I ask, when I ask, and what purpose I say and how I phrase it. So a challenging question for me to think through is this one here. So given that I just showed you there's measurement error in the responses, right? it's not clear to me how we treat that in a DP setting, right? Because, like, okay, well, maybe I'm like 0.8 really in the one category, and the other 0.2 of my answer really would belong to 0. So there is some randomness in that process. Can I, should I, do I have to, account for that randomness in the answer process when I create the differentiated private data, right? And if so, to which extent, right? I mean, that's, or do I ignore that, but then I make them fixed and then I cement an error that otherwise we would, try to factor out. So that's sort of an interesting puzzle to me. Another puzzle to me is if someone in this response process, maybe to the sensitive questions that we showed you before, decides to not answer or decides to give me a false information, and now I'm going in, and with our great latent variable models and whatever have we, right? We impute data, or we, alter the data in some way that the true value is now in, because that was the best predictor, and that, I mean, we actually know your answer given everything else and what everything else said. Then we are taking agency away from the respondent who just tried to give me wrong information, right? So not clear to me here, maybe you guys thought about this already, but for me this was sort of a puzzle as I was trying to see what this data collection process, how that might be affected by what we do here. Okay, so that's on the measurement side. Moving on, or maybe I should pause here for a second too if there are any questions. I see nodding heads for now. All right, moving on to the other side of that graph here, on the representation side. So we heard yesterday, you define your population, that's fine. You have hopefully a sampling frame that helps you get the addresses that you need, or collect the data that you need. But with many of the frames, we do have already an error here, which we call coverage error. I mean, there's really a data source that allows us to actually, I only know of the Netherlands as being having a beautiful solution to this problem here, because they define the target population as everyone who is on the sampling frame. So when I once asked them, it's like, how do you deal with illegal immigrants? They're not on your population register, and they say, well, we don't care. We make inference to who is on the population register, so that's it, right? That's a beautiful trick to get rid of that coverage error. But for everything else, you kind of have that problem already. We heard yesterday that once we have the sampling frame, that we deal with sampling error and sampling variance. But the one piece that we also heard was quote unquote, most samples are, well, let's assume that samples are a simple random sample. Now, the graph you see here is a pretty important survey done by the University of Michigan since 1959 on consumer sentiment. Right? So every month they ask 500 people how they see economy growing. And this data is used by Federal Reserve Board. I think they even pay for that data collection. And it's a pretty, makes the news every time they come out, right? And so my question too is, like, if you try to get a sentiment of the economy from 500 people in the US at random, how would you do that?
Phone numbers.
Phone numbers. Okay, phone numbers. So where do you get the phone numbers from?
The phone book.
Right, exactly, the phone book, right? And so on the phone, you might be, there's no phone book, right? So we generate numbers at random. There are phone banks. You know which portions of phone numbers are used so that you don't dial, into nothing. Plus, you need to know how many of the ones you tried actually responded. So there's a whole machinery to even get that right. But that's the closest we would come to a simple random sample. And then you still have a problem that it's particular interviewers doing an interview, and I show you in a moment why that is a problem. But Cynthia.
So, this is going to sound obnoxious, but why do you care about it actually being a simple random sample? If what you're really interested in is trend, as long as you do it more or less the same way every time, is that sufficient?
Yeah, so very good point. This is, you have been hanging out with Roberto Ribongon too long, because that was exactly his point, why he was like, let's move to the online world and, measure consumer prices and what have you on the online world. That's, always done the same. It reflects the offline world. So there are workarounds. I'm not saying you can't do proxies. There are certainly other ways to do this, I would agree. The fallback on random samples is the hope for a safeguard to really capture, the mixture that we have in the population, right? And that you don't, that not all in a certain subgroups you don't think about, develop a different perspective and you don't capture it, right? And that's why a random sample, it doesn't need to be a simple random sample, but that's why a random sample doesn't work. The reason why I point out the simple random sample piece is only because every formula Sasha showed yesterday, for which there is already a DP solution in doing hypothesis testing, for which there's already a DP solution for regression, what have you, they all assume that it is a random sample. And what I'm saying is in practice, because they are so hard, we hardly ever do a simple random sample. So what we do instead, I saw your hand just a second. What we do instead are samples that we call, multi-stage, stratified, clustered, a whole bunch of other things. But for those, we don't have DP solutions yet. So even, hypothesis testing, in that sense, it's not solved for survey data because the sampling structure is not correctly reflected, and that has huge consequences for the errors. But you had
This is just a kind of technical question. A little bit bouncing off what Cynthia said, which is if it's not longitudinal,
Yeah.
so you're going back to the same people, then maybe it's less important. But
Correct.
if you're saying that each 500 has to be sort of the same in a certain way, then I think the randomness seems more important.
Yeah, so this is a mix of these two techniques. So they go back to the same people twice, but then they ask new people. So it's over the years, always a new set of people that come in. So yeah, you're right.
I just want to add, I completely agree with you about the single random sample, but also that theoretically, right, that the pure theory that many, especially people here who are interested in, the statistical theory, relies on simple random sampling, the assumption of simple random sampling, right? And of course, we have a good theory for non-IID situations, some settings, but already with multi-stage stratified clustering, there are some, from design perspective, solutions in terms of how you account for the variability and variance and how you perhaps deal this with models. But it's not like, oh, I know exactly the central limit theorem and it's unique in all the settings when I talk about all multi-stage sampling and things like that.
Right.
So that core, theoretical perspective that I said yesterday, simplified theoretical perspective, does not exist in many of these settings.
Exactly, and so.
That's the problem.
So just for allowing everyone to catch up what we mean with stratified and clustered, because I realized I too can have technical terms that no one understands. So when we say stratified, we mean, you divide your population up in sort of distinct sets of people, either geographically or, by characteristics and what have you. And then you sample out of these different strata. And the reason you do this, the effect this will have, it will reduce your variance, right? Because if you think of random samples out of this, right, you can sometimes end up with just red or just blue or just circles and just squares and, what have you. So much higher chance for variability than here, where you know that you have a fixed proportion, or you can, know ahead of time what that is. In clustered samples, it's a little different. In cluster samples, you basically just have subgroups, right? And you do that often in combination with these. So let me give you an example. In this National Crime and Victimization Surveys, because they try to make estimates for the entire country, right? You would stratify the country by states or by northeast, southwest, whatever, like regional strata. And then within that, you would want to have a random sample. But how do you do that? That survey is done face-to-face, so an interviewer comes to your house. That would be huge travel cost. If you had a magic population register from which we could sample addresses, right, and have all people, but then they still, it would take forever to get to all these places and would cost a ton. So what they do instead, they they have multiple rounds of going from, a large area to smaller areas, and then go, to one town or one neighborhood and do all the interviews there. So then it's clustered geographically, right? So that's what happens in pretty much all surveys that are done face-to-face. What this does is it increases your variance by a lot, right? Because then you have people who live closer together, they are inevitably a little more similar, right? They can afford the same houses, they, exposed to the same crime and what have you, right? But even on the phone surveys that I mentioned before, we actually have clustering going on because of the interviewer, right? So the interviewers too, they have their own way of talking to you, right? Their own way of appearing, and we have seen in countless research studies that does affect the answers and makes the answers of the respondents more similar to each other than they would be otherwise, right? And so that's a huge problem. So the clustering piece, as I said, enlarges our standard error, meaning makes our confidence intervals larger. So here's an example where we used data from the PISA study, the OECD study that measures math achievement and language achievement across lots of countries. And here's the difference between Denmark and the US on taking the correct sample design of the survey into account versus not. So here's the point estimate for Denmark. And in Denmark, small country, not so much going on. I mean, there probably was a simple random sample, and the PI did this herself. But in the US, you have a huge sampling design effect, so that if you use the correct standard error, a test of the difference between those two would say there's no difference between the US and Denmark. Whereas if you use the incorrect standard errors, the simple random sample standard errors, you would think that there is a difference that is significant between these two, right? And that's the problem, and that's why it's so important to, like, any, reports that come out, any theories that are tested, that you take the sample design into account. And that means when we do this DP, we also have to take it into account. Yeah.
Is it the case that for the commonly used sample designs, it's sort of very easy to do this adjustment, or very easy meaning it's sort of the methodology is well established, you take a class, it's pretty clear, everybody would agree on what the right adjustment is?
Yeah. So for many techniques that is the case, although you would be astonished, and I have a reference, I think a couple of slides down, it's still not used, I mean, so some colleagues of mine and a former student, they did like a survey of papers published in the tier 1 economics and medical journals and whatnot. I mean, it's frightening to see how many just ignore that. They report on simple random sample standard errors when they do their modeling, right? So yes, agreed upon, used, not necessarily. But it's not, by now we're pretty far along with techniques, but I would still say there are plenty of statistical modeling techniques where that is not developed yet. But for the most of them, yes. And you don't necessarily, so closed form solutions have been developed for some. For others, you can model it in a different way, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And maybe that could be a direction for solution for here.
Yeah, I guess one of my questions was sort of about, to what extent is there a judgment call involved on the part of the analyst, where they have to decide, oh, well, I'm going to model this population is uniform, or to what extent does the person analyzing the data have to make kind of choices that affect?
Yeah, usually the proper weights, and some of this is captured through replicate weights, we'll talk about in a moment, are provided by those that create the data. So an informed analyst uses that, and then it should come out for everybody in the same way. So if you know the sample design of your study and you pay attention to it, then you can do it right. Then there's little analyst choice left at that point. Yeah. If that's your question.
Yeah, that was one of the questions.
You had a question.
Yeah, so you were talking earlier about linking sort of data that's generated outside of surveys to surveys. Given the focus of this workshop, are you going to talk a little bit more about that later?
About that, in which respect?
So, how do people try it? So you said that people
Yeah.
are generally open to doing that. So,
Yeah, yeah.
What are,
Yeah, I'll say a few things to that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so another point I want to make, aside from the costs that we have here, sort of for statistical precision, right? I did think it might be helpful to tell you that these surveys also cost a lot of money. So, a face-to-face half-hour interview in the US easily costs $1,000 a case. So now you take a survey that has 30,000 respondents, that's expensive. So if you feel an outcry of people messing with the carefully crafted, precisely measured measurements, and you say, oh, we add a little bit of noise, which basically shrinks your sample size, which means you have to collect more data, it really costs, it hurts, and that's part of the reason why people are quite sensitive about that. I mean, all this machinery, all this statistical development and getting the standard errors right and coming up with fancy sampling techniques to reduce the variance and reduce the variance is not to then later on afterwards come in and add noise and it's like, just collect a few more cases, right? So that you can do that maybe on the mail, it's sufficiently cheaper, but not as good, right? The high quality government survey data, they still have a strong face-to-face component. I mean, they are struggling as it is to keep the money for the surveys. The response, it gets expensive every year, more expensive because response rates aren't increasing and things like that. But this is just something sort of in the back of your mind as you talk with practitioners. There's a real value to that. And time as well, of course. More sample means much more time needs to be invested to collect the data. All right, so we talked a little bit about adjustment, obviously non-response, not everyone responds, right? So we have another error source that comes into that we tend to model to your question is the agreed upon way to do this. So there's agreed upon way on how you adjust for the sample design, right? So clustering and stratification and the unequal weighting probabilities, that's nailed down, I would say, by and large. Much less clear what's the proper way to do non-response adjustment, in part because we need outside data, we need census data, as benchmarks or other sources where we can really know, okay, these are the people we're missing and that's how we are weighting our data in order to remove any bias from people who do not participate, okay? I have a shorter audio clip here just to sort of show you the recruitment challenge.
I've been called so many. I know. It's a national study we're doing here. We're just talking to 300 adults at random. And we just happen to get your number.
We are doing a research on how people live in the United States make decisions about their health. This project is being conducted by the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan.
Hello. Okay. Well, we basically this is we call 500 households each month, and the data.
So this is just to hone in the point, interviewers do play a role, right? So even if you think you have a simple random sample, no clustering, the interviewers vary so much in their voices. We did studies on their vocal properties and predicting the probability to recruit people into the sample. There are quite some, there's an optimal speed, there's an optimal number of pauses and ums and ums, to do the recruitment. So that means they selectively sample into the study already through the way they work, but then also in the interaction with the respondent, they do tend to create clustering effects. So that's certainly something to pay attention to. So in summary, for the segment here, question is how do we get unbiased estimates using DP? What sample size do we need? What does that mean really if we have a certain level of precision we try to reach? What can we do to take the violation of IID into account? Violated by having interviewers, violated by having longitudinal data, violated by interviewing households rather than individuals, which is also something that we do quite often to save time. Time and money actually. And then if there were a situation where we have limited access due to a privacy budget, of course, a question that comes up in the discussions that I have is like, can we justify all these costs? If then the public good is somewhat limited in its access afterwards, right? So that's another thing that people do worry about. Okay. I promised to talk a little bit about the analysis side as well, although we covered a little bit of it here. One thing I thought might be useful to remind us here is that the research question the social scientists ask, they're really general. And they're really, I mean, we could have a whole nother conversation on what's good science, right? And I don't want to go there, but let's just assume the science they do and the science they would like to continue to do would need to be done with data in DP. So these are, I clipped those from, good journals in these respective fields, key research questions that they ask. What I've seen sort of published this month. And you can see the way these questions are formulated leaves a lot of room for analyst choices. So to your point, Adam, right? Not so much on the correct variance estimation, but pretty much for everything else, right? And what is interesting is that for many of these questions, even the methodology used to later on analyze the data is not necessarily clear ahead of time, right? I mean, if you look at the different fields, they have their typical methods, right? So a psychologist, if they do their own experiment, I already gave it away, right? They go in and with the notion of I do experiments. If not, then, they use ANOVA type methods. Economists would usually use some version of regression or time series analysis, depending on what data you deal with. In sociology, in related fields, you see a lot of multi-level random effect models. Demography has a lot of time to event models. And we could now, spend the next 2 months going through all of these, and their respective assumptions and where the errors are in. I hope you didn't think I would give that kind of talk here, because that would have been impossible to do, right? But I'm happy to sort of pick some, to the extent there's interest to look a little deeper into methods used for these fields. But to get an idea of the process and workflow of data analysis in these fields is they're using these methods and they're using them on data most often provided by someone else through these data archives, right? ICPSR has a big data archive. There's one in the UK, one in Germany, and many, many more. And then they go in, with their very broad research question and the data they have there, and then there is, a large exploratory portion to it. And you see it even in the published papers, right? So apologize for that. I would never put that in a talk, but for the purpose here, it will serve our needs. If you can't read this at the end, these are the it's a multi-level model, social psychology. Variance between countries within a country. This is the European social survey that they used. And then a linear regression model. They try to estimate risk factors for depression among immigrants and ethnic minorities and compared that to the rest. So these are the two variables of most interest, and then they try to adjust for a whole bunch of other variables, age and where they live, and some employment status variables. And what you often see in these journals is, so they have their first model and then they include a few more variables and a few more and sort of see what happens. And sort of this exploratory nature is very much part of how data is analyzed, which makes it hard, if you have a situation where you upfront need to tell someone, this is the analysis I'm going to do, these are the variables I'm going to need, and get your private data that way, right? So that I don't think that that this will work. So the model selection is unclear. The strong reliance on or focus on standard errors to guide some of these choices is a problem. The very large mix of categorical and continuous variables is an interesting challenge in these models, if we think about that, and of course the complex data structure that I mentioned before in the multi-level model. And last but not least, so in this study here, they actually found a few outliers in their model and then went after these. I mean, not literally, they didn't go after these respondents, but they looked much closer and drilled even further down in the data set to learn what's going on here. And I see this a lot, that the discovery actually happens in the data analysis, and that triggers the next study, right? Or even, teams of researchers that then pair up and someone goes out and does qualitative interviews with those outliers to see what's going on and what can be learned, right? So if you can't get to the outliers anymore, or you don't know who they really are, or not their whole set of characteristics, then that piece of discovery is closed, right? Yeah.
So just sort of drilling down the adaptive process, to what extent is this okay, statistically speaking?
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying it's like we can have another discussion whether this is good science, right? So I have a little opinion piece that I started writing on sort of, okay, well, if we as social scientists embrace DP, right, maybe that makes all of us better people, right? in the sense that we would upfront specify exactly what we want to do, you know, before we collect the data, and we're really clear, and then we just run this one model, and we pre-register what we plan on doing, and then we, you know, granted, that could be a version, right? All I'm presenting here, that's absolutely not how it's done right now, right? And so if there's, I mean, journals are pretty good and reviewers are pretty good in sort of pointing out issues of multiple testing, and it's adjusting your standard errors when you do that too much and things like that. So there is awareness of that problem, and depending on the quality of the journal, it's done more or less, right? But I thought it might be useful for you just to sort of know that that's how they work with the data, right? I mean, I'm not saying this is how we should work with the data forever. I'm just saying currently, in order to understand why there are communications problems in convincing another idea, you know, they feel a threat that this kind of working with the data is not possible. Right? Cynthia, did you have a question? Or? No. Don't want to put you on the spot.
So with DP, you wouldn't have to write down in advance what you were going to do or what was the one model you were going to fit, because the DP also protects you against p-hacking.
Yeah, so exactly. So that's the point I made earlier. So this advantage of, you know, I mean, yesterday Sasha made this a couple of times. I mean, I love it from the perspective that we are basically forcing all of us to embrace robust statistics, right? So I think that's an excellent and a very important point, right? And so I'm absolutely with you. That was the first version of this talk, right? And then I thought, well, wait a second. I mean, I need to tell you sort of what the concerns are on the other end, you know. I'm with you that can be a good thing, but certain elements here, for example, this interest in outliers, you know, and a certain element of discovery is then still not possible, right? And so while I see often, you know, sensitivity analyses done and eventually, you know, I mean, so the data analysis is really quite iterative process and has almost a design aspect to it, if you will, right? Because people try out a lot of things with the data. Before it gets published, it often ends up being then, you know, yes, now we use a robust statistic model, or now we, you know, like constrain ourselves in other ways. But there's a lot of learning going on with the data itself, and, you know, looking at particular cases, outliers, as I said. And so that's an element, I think, that we need to take serious. And mostly because it's so expensive to get to the data in the first place. Yeah.
So there are two things that I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the discussion of outliers.
Yeah.
DP is not good if you really need to see the outliers.
Right.
Hides them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other is the adaptivity.
Yeah.
Which it's fine with.
Yeah.
So your point again is that the outliers are really, really, I mean, Steve Feinberg used to say this all the time.
Yeah.
And everything that's interesting is in the outliers.
So,
but I've never understood it, so.
yeah, so I'm with Steve on that, and that's, I mean, I had an email exchange with my, well, I'm not going to say with whom, but anyway, I mentioned that I'm giving this talk and showed this opinion piece where I say, well, this could be a blessing for the social sciences, because they're forced to do robust statistics if we do DP, right? But his response was basically along the lines of, well, this is the end of science, because the real interesting thing happens in the outliers and in that discovery process, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, thanks for a rather strong opinion, but, you know, the point is, and we've seen this in other places too. I mean, the point is, if we want to move forward, right, we have to have that conversation. We have to bring people on board, right? And one concern, and that's, so thank you for pointing that out. One concern that I have heard, and that's my list of questions here, you know, is, can I still work with the data in the way I'm used to? And, you know, if the answer already is for some of it, yes, great, right? To the extent we fix the standard error part. But if, for certain elements it's not, and then it's good to know what those are. Yeah.
I'm also trying to understand sort of how the interest can be in the outliers. Let me try to tell a story that I'm just sort of making up right now and see if maybe this is part of it. Which is, when you look in the outliers, obviously you miss a lot of things that could have been in the outliers but aren't there.
Right.
Obviously, a lot of times you see something that's actually not of statistical significance, but in many cases, you don't have a big enough sample to be doing the science that you want to be doing. And so when looking in the outliers, you sometimes see sometimes useful hints of some other data you should have gathered or some other question you should have asked. And so looking in the outliers, even though it doesn't have sort of statistical significance in our usual sense, it can sometimes be useful in guiding the future science. Is that?
That's how I would characterize it. That's what I would characterize it. And I do think that this argument is somewhat short-sighted, because if you have enough data and you have enough signal with the outliers, you will still see that after DP.
Right. I think the sort of starting point is you don't have enough data.
Right.
And you're looking in the outliers where
if you
may see things that are not relevant.
Absolutely. If like in a future scenario where all the admin data and all the tech data are DP and we can get them and then we can add survey data to it, somehow, and have much fewer survey data and can learn. There can be a beautiful new data world out there for the social sciences researchers that I can envision, and that's why I'm here and like to work on it. But if we want to march that way, I think it is important to just be aware of what the concerns are and understand that, just pointing to a larger sample size, as some of that, does not necessarily cut it as an argument for the reasons I gave before, because larger sample size is really expensive, right? And so, so yes, the short answer is yes. You had another question.
So we can follow up on this offline, but I was just wondering that, it seems like what you're trying to do with the outliers is not really DP, but more like information flow, like the talk yesterday. So for the outliers, you actually want to control that flow in some sense, but you want to see the raw data, not the DP data. Yeah, exactly. You want to see the raw data. I just want to point to a couple of other points before I have the clock in mind, but just,
Let me say that since this has been fairly interactive and there have been lots of questions, I think it'd be fine to take a little more time.
Okay. All right, good.
I don't want to put how much more time?
Not too much, but I have a few more slides.
You have, there's...
10 minutes.
Super rigid, right?
10 minutes. We'll be out here in 10 minutes. So, but
in an insulated container.
So yes, to your point, I think that this is a way to think about it, and there could be other ways to get back to the raw data and have that information flow and discovery without a doubt. As I said, none of these points I make here, are arguments with which I think I would want to shut that operation down. That's not the role I'm playing here, right? I just want to make that clear. There are a couple of situations, though, in which, and we've discussed this in the intro talk on Monday, where DP is, not, or I don't know if the answer is never will or not yet there, but in the survey data collection world, it has become pretty popular and reasonable, similar to the medical field, to work in a responsive way, right? Where you, based on the data you have, you sort of learn, you build a predictive model on what's the probability to get the next respondent and what's the probability of that respondent to actually give you more information into the sample, or is that someone who is just like everyone you have and therefore you don't need to go after that person, right? So this requires linkage of different data sets, but it also requires a predictive model on which you want to act on, right? And obviously policymakers that would want to use data, they want to do interventions or what have you and would have the same problem, right? So this is not exactly outlier, but it's sort of in a similar vein that you want to know something exactly about a case and want to act upon, whether it's re-interviewing that person to understand whether they gave you wrong answers and therefore are weird, or re-interview and learn more about their life, or if you want to act in an intervention kind of way would be sort of similar settings. Yeah. Was there a question here? Yeah.
I mean, I think I appreciate the question that you asked because, and this is maybe abstract and it's for the rest of the semester. If you are the owner of the database, like you are an insider in the IRS or an insider in the census, and you perform some computation on the data that isn't deep, and you learn something about the data that you cannot publish, but you think is a significant finding. And I think this is...
Yeah, this is very much related. So
what do you know, I think we have ways of coping with those things. So
yep.
It's just kind of, we have to, I think, have language to describe these different, and I use the term threat models, it's not very...
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and this is exactly where sort of end up here. I do think there are different scenarios and different types of data that require different means, right? I mean, obviously, I mean, if you have a scenario where no one ever gets to the raw data, then this is not possible, right? But what you're describing is there could be settings in which, at least for sort of the data cleanup part and what have you, you still have access to the raw data and you can do that, right? And so then it depends on sort of the complexity of the research questions and how that's organized. I mean, it's a different type of problem, a different nature of a problem, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so clear, I mean, in any other setting, this would clearly kill the talk and the conversation here, I'm not so sure, but there one more book for the library.
I'll ask you for the list later.
In the variance estimation and bias correction afterwards, I promised you that I talk about that for a moment. Just want to give sort of a hint here on the different approaches that we do in order to, like on the analysis side, in order to take the complex sample design structure into account. And so there's one set here, you know, for linear estimators, you have there are exact formulas that take that sampling structure into account. When you don't have that, most of the time, or very popular for a long time, we're solving this via tailored linearization. So that has been very popular. What's done more and more, I'd say, at least by the more sophisticated data collectors, is you know, applying what we call replicate weights, right? And replicate weights basically means that you divide, you know, your full sample into subsamples of replication, and then you repeat the weighting computation for each subsample, and that includes the base weight, the adjustments, any calibration you did in order to account for non-response and things like that. And you include all the information on stratification and clustering. And so these replicate weights basically are one way that can be done by the data provider, right? That captured sort of the complex nature of the survey, and then are used in the analysis. So I haven't thought this through, but that could be one route in which this is then possible in DP. I have to think more about that. Another piece that I hear is concern with the census moves the way it's planning to move is a lot of surveys, in particular the smaller ones, in particular the ones that don't rely necessarily on a very careful collected random sample, they need these data for non-response adjustment. The popular method is general regression estimator to do that, where you have basically two portions in there. You have your survey data and I mean the inputs weight from your survey, and then a vector of population totals that you get from the census or other places. And I mean the American Community Survey is a very, very popular data source for that. And so it might still be possible, and they might already have thought about all these secondary uses of the data, but that's something that I heard people say they're getting very nervous about. It's like, is this still sufficiently workable then as a source for adjusting for all these other surveys, right? So that's something to keep in mind. From all I've heard so far, I think the answer is yes, but you know, just want to put that out there for discussion. So on this part of the analysis side, replicates weights and DP, that would be an interesting thing to find out. The population benchmark piece is, you know, more and more as people are concerned whether they have biases in the data is an important one. And then Sasha, you mentioned that yesterday. if the route is synthetic data, and in particular that route allowing sort of working with the data more interactively, right? Then I mean, you already listed all the open questions in that space. So I think I'm looking forward to that discussion. I do think there's a lot of merit if people, I think people can get their head easily around the synthetic data way of working with data, but then if I understood you correctly, we haven't figured out the variance estimation for that necessarily either.
Debate right now about it. We thought we did, but there's a debate.
Okay, all right. Well, lots to learn for me in that space. Okay, so on the last minute that I promised I have here, the example I wanted to come back to just to give you a sense of what type of data linkage we often face and have. So at the Institute for Employment Research, a typical set of administrative data that we have are Social Security Administration records. So every day of employment and the type of job you have and your salary to the day, and that for the last since 72, I think we have the research base at hand. So, for anyone employed in Germany or gainfully employed in Germany, we have these data. And these data are already linked to survey data, so to answer your question. And here, sort of these linkage rates really are, as high as 80-90%. Because people who participate in this part, there's like, okay, well, participating in a research study, there's no hesitation then to add more data to this research process. The other way around, where the legislation on what linkage requests need to be asked varies widely, and actually after GDPR it has gotten a little easier for the research community in Germany to link data, and not harder, surprisingly. But that is a different story. But to your question of an example, so that would be a typical setting, and what we have just recently done is link that. People who were in the combination of these two data, ask them to participate in a smartphone study that is not unlike, I don't know, people read the news last night, not unlike the research apps that travel the use right now, pretty much access to anything the phone can measure. And yes, the consent statements here is nothing we would have ever gotten through a German IRB board. We had, during the onboarding process, at least 7 other pages of consent that people had to actively opt into and read, and we measured the time they read. And a big endeavor to make sure we know people were exposed to the consent. But then the question we get is like, so internally, to your point, Helen, internally we can analyze these data easily, right? But of course, this is such an expensive endeavor. All these data sources cost a lot of money, and other researchers want to analyze the data. And so for us, the question is like, how can we give that to someone else, right? A completely chaotic data structure, the large administrative data structure, not chaotic, but complex, right? The survey data over 10 years, panel wave, and then all of the sensor measures from the phone. I don't know, right? Can I make these available through DP tomorrow? Probably not, right? And so, but that's what people ask us now. And so, the often populated solutions, and Daniel works with Julia Lane on projects and kindly funded projects like that, is to create researcher spaces, in which those data can be housed and analyzed by people who are vetted and output that's controlled. And you mentioned these research data centers yesterday, right? The question, though, in all these models is where, you have a safe environment and then you work inside there is, given the complexity of the data, you do want to, and the large interest in it, how can we scale that? So I think there are a lot of interesting computer science and theoretical problem also on that side. It's like, could we automate that whole process? Can I automatically check if someone writes codes that would violate? Can I automatically, look at the output and whatnot? And I know that some people who are here working on that element, so that's why I thought I throw that up as an additional route that is sort of, for the now and immediate, also an important problem to solve, because the owners or institutes like the IIB that have, that have the data of the type that I described, they want to share, and they just need to find a vehicle to do so. Thank you.
I think given the time, we'll take the further discussion offline for the next 3 months, 4 months, over the, we'll resume on time at